Okay, now for the afternoon program, the main event. Marc Appleton established Appleton Associates Architects in 1976, specializing in custom residential, institutional, and commercial projects. He has offices in Santa Monica and Santa Barbara, California. His work frequently draws upon the traditions of vernacular architecture to evoke a presence of the past. Marc has written several books, including volumes on California Mediterranean architecture and a monograph on George Washington Smith, an early 20th century architect who popularized the Spanish colonial revival style. Marc's firm has been selected every year since 1991 to appear on Architectural Digest's list of the top 100 design firms, one of only 10 firms that have appeared on this prestigious list every year. So it's a great pleasure to introduce a talented architect, a gentleman, and a scholar, Marc Appleton.
Can you all hear me? Is that working? Yeah. It's great to be here. I'm amazed at the turnout. I think this is a wonderful event. I want to thank Robert and Deanne for putting this together. I hope this is a wonderful 3 days that we all have together. My talk today, and I know I'm short on time already, is in two parts. They were originally developed as separate talks, but this is an attempt to put them together. And they're a bit more autobiographical than academic, and therefore, I hope, a little closer to home. This is an aerial photo, there it is, from about 1930 of Florestal, the name given to the estate my maternal grandparents created on Hope Ranch in Santa Barbara, California, in the early 1920s. And it's a place that became a significant part of my family's life for almost 60 years. What I'm about to share with you is not just about the architecture of this house and its gardens, but it's also a bit of a family chronicle and appreciation of it through the more emotional lens of my own experience as a grandchild and then later, much later, as an architect. When we grandchildren visited Florestal, it was like having a silver spoon put in our mouths for 2 weeks and having it rudely yanked out 2 weeks later when we went home. I love this picture of my grandparents. They were married in 1917. And my grandmother, everybody called my grandmother Girly. She was to become a longtime member of the Santa Barbara Garden Club. She loved the theater, and in her later years drove a red convertible Buick, a car she even drove with the top down to my grandfather's funeral. And she became a bit of a legend in Santa Barbara. This is actually, let me go back, sorry, because I left my grandfather out. Well, let me go forward. I think there's a picture of him coming up. This is where my grandfather grew up. It's a house on Long Island. It's now the Nassau County Art Museum. It was designed by Ogden Cogman, who co-wrote The Decoration of Houses with Edith Wharton, and this was my grandfather's childhood home. This was my grandmother's childhood home, also on Long Island, called Lillooet. And here's my grandmother again. She had the privilege of opening the Lobero Theater, which is a theater in Santa Barbara designed by George Washington Smith and starred in the first play that was done there called A Beggar on Horseback. Here's another picture of my grandfather. When my grandmother came out in New York as a debutante, she apparently had about 100 proposals of marriage And what on earth she saw in my grandfather still mystifies me. He was in many ways as unsociable as she was gregarious. He was, by and large, as I remember him, an unhappy man, an incorrigible hypochondriac. He never felt well, and on top of that, he wasn't a very faithful husband. I got along with him pretty well, I think because we both liked trout fishing and because at the time I was much too young to understand his failings. But despite his shortcomings, I think my grandmother put up with their relationship with as much grace and poise as she could. And whatever their eventual differences, in the beginning, they shared quite a bit of sense of adventure. And for their honeymoon, they packed into Yosemite on horseback. This is 1917. No roads to speak of in Yosemite. And you can tell they were a pretty adventurous couple. This is long before Ansel Adams, but the same view. And a place that they really particularly fell in love with was Santa Barbara. And the first house that they rented there was this house. It was the Henry Dater house, designed by Bertram Goodhue in 1919. And they rented it for about 3 years. There's another picture of it, more recent. Some of you might know it as Val Verde. You can see that my grandmother was posed by my grandfather, who was an amateur photographer, in many different costumes. This one in the courtyard of the Val Verde estate. And here's my mother, also at Val Verde. In the early 1920s, they both became partners with 3 other couples in a real estate purchase of an area north and west of Santa Barbara called Hope Ranch. And this is Hope Ranch in the early days. And my grandparents, each of the 4 general partners, chose a parcel on Hope Ranch. And the parcel chosen by my grandparents, you can see in the middle of the photo there, bordering the ocean for about a mile. And it was largely bean fields along the open part and oak trees behind. I love that picture with the plane up there. This must have been a fairly adventurous ride for my grandfather at the time. And here they are on their new purchase. They hired George Washington Smith, a local Santa Barbara architect, to design a house for them. And these were some early sketches by Luda Riggs, who worked for George Washington Smith, of a house that wasn't built for them. And I've been told that they went through 20 different schemes before arriving at the final scheme. And I once asked my grandmother what it was like to work for the great architect. And she quickly replied, rather disparagingly, "Oh, he knew nothing about Spanish architecture. I had to teach him everything." By then, I took this with a grain of salt because I knew it wasn't true. He'd already designed 10 houses in and around Santa Barbara, including this one, his first one in 1919. Another thing happened in 1925, which was the Santa Barbara earthquake. The Santa Barbara earthquake of 1925, and it was a pretty devastating earthquake. It really destroyed all of the masonry buildings in downtown Santa Barbara. And as a result of that, my grandparents reinforced the house and set it back a little further from the edge of the cliff than I think they had originally planned. Those were pictures of the same view of the front of the house, from this one from 1980, the earlier one from about 1930. I would like to read you a paragraph from an introduction I wrote some years ago to Rexford Newcomb's 1928 book, Mediterranean Domestic Architecture in the U.S., that I think captures what my grandparents, like other early 20th century newcomers, may have been looking for when they came to Santa Barbara. They were well-educated, cosmopolitan, upper-class New Yorkers with long-standing family roots in that part of the country. One might imagine they had no business leaving all this to move across the continent and assume a new Spanish identity, but they did, willingly inspired and wholeheartedly captivated by the notion that they could start over by reinventing another heritage for themselves. So complete, so sensitively understood, and richly detailed was the result, that only a generation later, we grandchildren easily accepted Florestal as our true ancestral home, time-worn, beautifully overgrown, and full of latent memories. Until I was old enough to understand, I never questioned the legitimacy of my grandparents' and Smith's invention, but grew up feeling a tangible sense of security in my family's mythical heritage, not in its actual New England past, but in its Mediterranean reincarnation in this beautiful new old place overlooking the Pacific Ocean. So I want to quickly take you through the house, which was designed around 3 courtyards. The ocean is to your left, the mountains to your right, and the entrance at the bottom of the slide is into this first courtyard, which you can get a glimpse of here through the doors. So this was really the entry hall to the house, outdoors, as is maybe appropriate for the Mediterranean climate of California. The design of this courtyard owed a debt to El Greco's house in Toledo, which my grandmother had visited in the early 20s on her version of the Grand Tour. And if you look carefully at the doors, for example, the grill work on the window, the somewhat bastardized ionic column, even the beam end details, and the terrace, you'll see a corollary with Florestal's courtyard, which is in many ways a kind of direct copy of El Greco's house. This is El Greco's house again. This is Florestal. Even on down to the beam end carvings. You went from that courtyard into a gallery, a long gallery that went crosswise, past the center patio, which was not on axis with the front patio, but a glimpse into it. This was the drawing room. This was the library, which was the great room in the house, all of the walls covered with books. This is the dining room. My grandmother's portrait is hanging, is the small one hanging to the left, her mother-in-law to the right in the larger portrait, and there was not too much love lost between the two of them. I remember when my grandfather died, the next day, his mother's portrait disappeared and something else appeared in its stead. This is one of the upstairs bedrooms. You can get an idea of the detail derived from Spanish ceilings in this picture. And one of the wonderful things about the house, and I think a great lesson for me later, was the notion that houses did not have to be environments that you walked into without walking outside again to get somewhere. So in true California fashion, the staircase was outdoors, undercover. It went upstairs, and you had to traverse these patios to get upstairs to the balcony, to the bedrooms upstairs. So there was this constant connection indoors and out that the house had. These are some of the terraces on the upper floor. This is a terrace above the dining room on the mountain side of the house. Years later, same view. And that was the original view of the mountains, now pretty much obscured by trees and development. This is the ocean side. And the house, oddly enough, or perhaps not so oddly enough, was really an interior house designed around the courtyards. It enjoyed this incredible setting, and it had, as you can see here, these wonderful pergolas that extended out towards the ocean on either side. This is a feature of the property that we all referred to as the gap. And it was not natural. In the beginning, and you can see here the house just following construction, there was quite a setback of the house from the edge of the cliff. And my grandmother despaired of not seeing enough of the ocean, so for 3 weeks she set up a high-pressure water hose and eroded the cliff, apparently uncovering half of a mastodon fossil in the process. And I understand this is the result, that the harbor in Santa Barbara was muddy for about 3 weeks following her little exercise. Today in California we have something called the Coastal Commission, which I'm sure would have arrested her and put her in jail for life. But back then, this was fair game. And on top of that, the earthquake had toppled over a number of palm trees that had lined Marina Drive that ran across the property. And they basically commandeered the palm trees and framed this view of the gap. This is the setting at the coastline there, very spectacular. And this is a photograph from today, and those of you familiar with Santa Barbara might recognize in the distance with the little tower, the University of California at Santa Barbara in the distance. Getting to the beach was a problem, even though my grandmother had a view of the surf from the house. And so in 1928, they hired the Otis Elevator Company to come up with this funicular that rode down what was essentially a 200-foot high cliff to a cabana that was built down at the ocean side. Needless to say, this was a great and fun affair for all of us grandchildren, getting to the beach every day this way. It's my mother, about 13 or 14, on the platform of what was to become the cabana. And I think one of the things that impressed me was the attention to detail that my grandmother really paid to everything. This is a setup for a birthday party at some point. These are the tile risers and the railing of the stair. That's that outdoor stair. My grandparents were very cavalier about the things that they'd inherited. Among them were these huge 19th century paintings of ships that hung here in the stairwell. Of course, the stairwell is outside. It's foggy. It's full of ocean breeze. And by the time we had arrived as grandchildren, all the paint had crawled on these canvases, and they were pretty much gone. I love this detail of the inverted tile under the balcony. More tile, and almost all the tile, as well as the light fixtures and some of the wrought iron work in the doors, were purchased, or had been purchased by my grandmother in Spain on her earlier trip there. And so I'm sure she foisted a lot of this on Smith. In the center courtyard, there's a water feature reminiscent of the Alhambra and the Generalife, where, which was also one of her stops on the Grand Tour, where the water from this fountain overflows, follows a little runnel to a center fountain, which also overflowed, which progressed to this flatter, shallower fountain, went underneath the back corridor in the house and popped out the other side in the rear patio, dribbled into this fountain, out the back doors, down the steps, and very unceremoniously into a drain at the end. This is one of her American interpretations of that wonderful Spanish feature that you do see at the Alhambra. Some of the grill work on the windows, the tile work on the interior patio. All of the terracotta was made on the property. There was a clay deposit at the rear of the property. And in true entry hall fashion, my grandmother, who loved flowers and had a flower room off the entry hall, every week would make a new arrangement for the hall table for that front courtyard. The house was really something special, but I think the gardens and their evolution and growth over time were what made a very strong and lasting impression on my young soul. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this here. They were all laid out by my grandmother. You can kind of see the gap in the upper left section there, framed by the palm trees, but there was a series of parterre gardens, Spanish garden, the rose garden, and these wonderful alleys, all of which she kind of organized to extend the house out into the landscape. This is at the back of the house, young palm trees, that same view later on, front of the house. The loggia in the central patio. This is my mother and father's wedding. And that loggia from a picture of about 1980 with these great camellias now full grown. Some of the alleys that divided the parterres. And this is how it began. She really put very small plant material in and was content to let it grow. This is later and later. Some of the parts of the garden that I think we enjoyed the most were the wilder parts. This was a magnolia walk, another area down below, so that these formal gardens really extended out into the landscape of what was 52 acres and started to transition very gradually into wilder and more less organized parts. This was a lily pond. These Monterey pine trees were about 2 inches high when they were planted. My grandfather apparently laughed at my grandmother and said they would never make it. And here they are, a full-grown forest. The estate actually had a business, which I doubt subsidized all of the developments on the place, but they grew cut flowers. You can see here a field of amaryllis, and shipped them all over the United States to various florists. There was an enormous vegetable garden and fruit orchard. And I think one of the things that stuck with me for many years was the kind of patina that developed on everything. Here you see the baby tears growing between the cracks, making a little nest for this pot, bird pot. The wear and tear became something that I think I actually grew very fond of as I became an architect. There were these odd garden ornaments and furniture scattered around in peculiar ways throughout the place. And you could never figure out why they were so casual about it. This is sitting on a couple of concrete blocks, I think. And this I could figure out. This was the hated mother-in-law again, relegated to some part of the garden that no one ever went to, I think. And there were scenes like this with the hoses and the business of things were never that tidy. The idea that this was a working garden somehow came across very strongly. And there were animals everywhere, always different. This is a family of ducks. The place had about 20 peacocks that were resident. We even had peacock for Thanksgiving one year. I don't recommend it, by the way. Typical scene, that's my aunt Sylvie growing up with not only dogs but a sheep on the front porch. My mother was a great animal lover. This was her Coatamundi pet. And when my mother was 12, my grandparents, who made a voyage to the Galapagos Islands, brought back, there are rules against this too, but at the time, brought back a dinner-sized plate Galapagos tortoise, and it became a member of the family and much remembered by everybody who visited. This is my grandmother, who always dressed like that, no matter whether she was informal or formal. And you could sit on Galapi, as he was called, and he would rise up and actually take you for a ride. He died very prematurely at the age of 52. I think they're supposed to live till they reach an age of 100, 110 years. And I'm sure it was dietary. You can see the watermelon there. It probably wasn't a native fruit on the Galapagos Islands, and he had a lot of food like that. This was one of my favorite places. This was my grandmother's personal garden, called her work garden. And I spent a great deal of time there with her. This is where she experimented with Watsonian amaryllis hybrids, for which she became quite famous. And I think it's also where she felt the most comfortable in many ways away from the formal public parts of the estate. She spent a great deal of time there. My grandmother died in 1980. She outlived my grandfather by over 16 years and had continued to live in the style to which she was accustomed. Unfortunately, this meant that all of the interest and most of the principal in the family's estate were gone by the time she died, and there was not enough left to pay the estate taxes, which were enormous. As a result, the property was sold in probate, and most of the family's belongings went off to auction. The house and the property you see here changed hands about 3 times and has been partially demolished, altered, and added to over the last 30 years or so. The gardens are entirely gone. By a happy coincidence, several years ago, clients of mine acquired the property and were in the process of partially restoring the old house and adding on to it. But in many ways, especially for me, it'll never be the same place. And I think with the passing of an era, change is to be expected. But among the things that I learned from Florestal is that landscape, both designed and natural, is really an essential part of what I think gives architecture a sense of place and what grounds it. I've, in my own career, designed many houses and gardens, but I've come to realize that new houses and gardens have no memories. Memories come with age and life and the passage of time. And if we're really good at what we do as architects and designers, I think we can give our houses a kind of potential for memory, a suggestion of memory, of history. But really our clients need to do the rest. And I think quality of life really comes from living in and tending and experiencing a place over many decades. And perhaps just as important, sharing it with others. So for almost 60 years, my grandmother and grandfather graciously welcomed many friends and strangers to Florestal. And I think she was so good at entertaining even uninvited guests that most of them have very fond memories of her and of Florestal years later. And I look at my own life, because 60 days in today's world is a long time. And in that time, my own home has moved 14 times. It's included 5 states and 2 countries. Somebody once told me that currently in the United States, the average family stays in one place for no more than 5 years. So I'm right there with that average. And I think the older we get, it seems that we look back and we realize we've spent half our lives leaving home, trying to leave home, and then maybe the second half trying to find it again. The older I get, the more I realize that history matters and makes the present richer. And for that, I owe my grandparents in Florestal a great debt. It's, I think, what has interested me more belatedly in the classical movement, and certainly these early experiences preceded my eventual career in architecture. But as I look back, I know in my heart that they've shaped my professional practice in many ways. I am, however, one of those transitional students whom, as Mr. Terry said, you have to be patient with. After a modern and postmodern education in the late 1960s and apprenticeships with several firms, all modern firms, including 3 years finally with Frank Gehry, 3 good years, I must add. When I finally started my own practice in 1976, I had begun to react to 2 things. First, that most architects I knew seemed rather obsessed with creating signature contemporary projects to impress not only their clients, but each other, it seemed. And the push to be original, to view architecture as art on a pedestal, seemed rather disconnected from what I had otherwise slowly begun to understand as a disciplined craft in the service of clients rather than an art. The second thing, and a corollary to this, was my growing appreciation not so much of the avant-garde architecture of Southern California, but of those who had practiced in the 1920s through the 1930s, and they were people like George Washington Smith, like Arthur Brown, Julia Morgan, Reginald Johnson, Myron Hunt, Gordon Kaufman, I could go on and on here, Wallace Neff. But these were all classically trained architects who, having emigrated to the West from eastern cities, became pioneering regionalists in California. And they were not only very good at what they did, but they seemed to me very flexible. They could work in a number of different styles for different clients in different situations without imposing a strong personal stamp on their buildings. In their practice, in a way, in Southern California, they had contributed so much to establishing Mediterranean revival architecture as a defining cultural force in Southern California, and I was very impressed by that. So here I was in 1976, starting a practice with muses who were all dead, admittedly a bit confused as a late modernist, but determined to make a go of it. And I guess I will also have to admit to Mr. Terry that most of my buildings probably are only going to last 25 years. But I'd like to share a few of them with you. These are chronological and cover about a 35-year period. This was one of my first projects. It was a renovation and addition to a 1920s John Byers hacienda house in Los Angeles. And I think what also influenced my thinking early on was quite simply that as a young architect, a lot of my first commissions were renovations, remodels, and additions to existing buildings. Not always good buildings, but in many cases buildings that already had a presence, already had character. And I still, to this day, consider renovations to be the most challenging, elegant, and conscientious thing we can do as architects. The living room of that house. This is the first iteration of the Museum of World Folk Art, Mingei International in La Jolla. This is another renovation. This was not a particularly prepossessing house to start with, unlike the John Byers. My client, however, was a lady named Betty Edwards who had written a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which achieved a certain amount of notoriety. And she taught a lot of people how to draw who had no inkling or notion that they could draw at all. And when I first met her, though, and I saw the house, I made the mistake of telling her that I thought it was one of the ugliest houses I'd ever seen, but that she had created this wonderful garden behind it, and we should really remodel and redesign the house around the garden. And luckily, she liked what I said. And this is the back of the house, which opened up to this marvelous garden at the rear of the house. This was an old warehouse in downtown Los Angeles that we converted to artist lofts with commercial spaces. There was this mews along the side that was a railroad track loading dock that we turned into a walkway. Interior of the lobby and the mailboxes. You're going to see a lot of back and forth here between contemporary and traditional architecture. But I tried to be as honest as I could going through these 35 years. But this house was really my first introduction to classical architecture, the classical orders, and the language of classicism. Not that I wasn't aware of classicism, but I don't think I was aware of how sophisticated and elaborate and wonderfully rich a language classicism was until I had the opportunity to do this house. And I had a very willing client who would even, on her trips to England, send me notes about how she'd just been to Christopher Wren's hospital, and she walked up to one of the windows and had looked at the profile of a Munton bar and said it's what we ought to use in the house, and she would actually have drawn it and sent it to me. So it was a great exercise. She was learning, I was learning, and I hope our true classicists here don't cringe too much, but it really was my baptism with classical architecture. About the same time, I did this conversion for Matt Groening, who was the creator of The Simpsons. It's on the canals in Venice, and he had a little bungalow and was drawing life in hell cartoons for a local rag. And in the middle of the project, after we had designed it the first time, his TV show was a great success, and of course we had to come back and redesign it. He bought the lot next door, and the thing turned into this wonderful cacophony of bungalow and shingle style stuff. This was a house and studio for an artist in Topanga Canyon. My first house returning back to New England was this house on Martha's Vineyard. Everybody designs a house for their mother, it seems, and mine came rather late in the game, but this was a house I did for my mother on the family ranch in Arizona. This one is in Telluride. It's a rather large, rambling compound of buildings, a little bit like an abandoned mine, perhaps, but trying to work with local vernacular in some fun and inventive ways. This was the stair hall, which interconnected all the different floors. We had 4 Navajo Indians build this, and they would arrive on the job site, work for about a month, earn enough money to go out and get drunk, we wouldn't see them for 2 months, and then they'd come back when they needed more money. Eventually, this got finished, though. They did a wonderful job. This is a house that I did, one of my favorite houses for a Greek client, American of Greek descent. It's in Southern California, and it's on this long quarter-mile lot. You arrive via the road on the left-hand side of the site plan there. We planted a orchard of olive trees that you drove through, and you finally arrived at the front of the house, which was this first picture here. And you went through almost a Greek village of forms. We broke the house into pieces, and the guest bedrooms and so forth were turned into smaller houses. And this is the main corridor, but you came out and really looked at this incredible view of the ocean. Another compound of buildings up in Marin County, this is the McAvoy Olive Ranch, and we were hired over a period of about 10 years to design 8 or 9 buildings here, including the main house, which is to the left. You can see here the kitchen family room of that house. My client was very adventurous. This is a Chinese pavilion that we did for her. These are the olive pressing barns and olive pressing equipment. It's wonderful to work with Italian mechanics. You don't understand a word they say, but somehow we figured it all out. This is a Italianate Mediterranean house in Pasadena. It curves slightly to take in the view of the arroyo in Pasadena. I'm back in New England here. This is a 200-year-old farmhouse that we restored and tweaked for a wonderful client. Unfortunately, she only enjoyed the house for a year before she died. But she was a wonderful decorator too, very colorful, and did the decoration. This is another house in Los Angeles. Now that creeping fig vine covers the entire loggia, both sides. One of the case study houses that we came into and did additions on in Los Angeles. A Spanish colonial house in Beverly Hills. This one designed very specifically around our client's program, with great attention to detail. Drawing again on the legacies of Wallace Neff and George Washington Smith for inspiration. Back of the house. Back in Martha's Vineyard again. This was a little beach house. Just a view from the porch with these tree branch columns. A Tuscan Italian farmhouse compound in Malibu. We've gotten quite involved in doing a lot of landscape work for a lot of our clients. This was a Smith house that we added a new family room, sort of kitchen, bedroom wing on that you're looking at down this alley, but we also put in the alley of olive trees. A house in Santa Barbara that owes a lot, I think, to English and New England precedents for farmhouses. It's built around a central courtyard, looks out over a vineyard towards the ocean, and is surrounded by parterre gardens. I think there's a little bit of Lutyens in that. Always one of my favorite architects to look at. This was the stables. we've also lately gotten involved in doing a number of hotels, the first of which was San Isidro Ranch in Santa Barbara. This was a new entrance that we created with olive trees and lavender. Planted the central gardens. It's about 40 cottages in resort cottages and 2 restaurants, all designed as a kind of compound on about 25 acres. Lily Pond, one of the restaurants. This was a project in Rancho Santa Fe we completed fairly recently, and it sits in the middle of a rather suburban environment, and our client had bought enough acreage to want to be able to screen out his neighbors, and so we not only designed all the buildings, but came up with this idea of planting a layer of landscaping and trees that would actually screen out the neighbors, and talked him into planting a lot of meadowland, which could be mowed into these horse paths. And this is just really 2 years later. Things grow quickly in California. This is the house, long, 60-foot long, 75-foot long water trough in the front of it. Kitchen garden. About the same time we were doing this house in Carmel, much more contemporary obviously, but designed around a series of oak trees that really allowed us to come up with a geometry that responded to all of that. A house we finished a couple of years ago in Santa Barbara. Dom Forte, who is still working feverishly over here in this group, had a lot to do with this house. We worked together on it. It owes a little bit of a debt, obviously, to Italian precedents, but also to Schinkel, I think. And you can probably see that here. What I always hope for in our work is that the personality of the architect is not as apparent as the personality of the building or the place. And the regional diversity, whether it's east or west, I hope overrides any attachment to a consistent architectural style or signature. And when I look back on 35 years of work chronologically, as you've seen it here, and I'd never really put it together in this way, I'm rather pleased at the diversity, but I still struggle with being stuck in 2 worlds. We are, in our office, I think, a both-and rather than an either-or practice, and obviously still do contemporary as well as traditional work. But like many people in this room, I'm sure, I've felt for a long, long time that modernisms and the many isms it has spawned has become a predominantly scaleless, stylistically hard-edged enterprise. It can be aesthetically exciting, but I do believe that it's lost many of its cultural connections that make it both relevant and human. The international style now seems to go everywhere around the globe, as its name implies, but in so doing, I wonder if it belongs anywhere. By the same token, I think that classicism, if it's practiced in an academic vacuum separate from some regional context, can also lose its cultural connections. So this isn't a risk that is just only a risk that modernism has. I think classicism in its own way could have that as well. In conclusion, I don't think I have any answers to the larger debate. The thing at the end of the day that I think I depend on most for the architecture of each project is to let it evolve, hopefully subtly from the lives, the needs, the dreams, and the idiosyncrasies of our clients and the places that they build in. And I suppose I trust this process really more to inspire a rich and more successful outcome than any preconceived aesthetic agenda, whether that agenda is modern or classical, contemporary or traditional. And I hope we can, in addition to getting together as a group of classicist people who are fascinated with the classical tradition, I hope instead of it being a standoff with modernism, that we can begin to have a little more of a dialogue between the two, because I'm convinced, as I have been in my career, that when you are introduced to classicism, it's hard not to fall in love with it. It's hard not to be seduced in it, and it's hard not to respect the value it seems to bring back into all our lives. Thank you very much for listening.